Hallo zusammen, hier ist Pascal von Neutrality Studies.
Hello everyone, this is Pascal Lotas from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm once again speaking with Sevim Dagdelen, a former member of the German Bundestag. She was initially a member of the Left Party, and later co-founded the Sahra Wagenknecht Alliance, together with Sahra Wagenknecht. She is also the author of the German-language book, NATO, A Reckoning with the Alliance of Values. Ms. Dagdelen, welcome back.
Hallo, vielen Dank für die Einladung.
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation, Mr. Lotas.
Ja, und vielen Dank, dass Sie es angenommen haben und dass wir uns wieder...
Yes, thank you very much for accepting the invitation and for giving us the opportunity to talk again. Something that was very interesting. You were recently in China and had the chance to meet Chinese politicians. You also visited the Chinese embassy and were criticized for it on Twitter, among other places. But now you've had a bit of direct contact with China. What is your impression of the German-Chinese relationship?
Ist Ihr Eindruck zum deutsch-chinesischen Verhältnis?
Na, ich glaube, was ganz wichtig ist, dass
I think what's really important is this. I was invited, among other things, to the Shangri-La Forum. That's a security policy conference, if not the most important one in the region, then certainly in the Asian area. There were over 1,800 participants from more than 100 countries. I was prominently invited there to speak on a panel. The focus was on assessing the international geopolitical situation 80 years after the anti-fascist war, the victory over fascism, Japanese militarism in Asia, and German fascism on the European continent. And there were many decision-makers present, including from Europe. But what was interesting was that Germany, meaning the federal government, wasn't represented at all. Only the military attaché from the German embassy in Beijing was present.
Es war nur der Militärattaché der deutschen Botschaft in Peking anwesend und ich finde das sehr schade, eigentlich auch.
And I find it very unfortunate, actually also foolish, that the federal government is not taking advantage of such an opportunity to engage in diplomacy there, to start conversations, to conduct dialogues. And it's really difficult when you have no representation. Believing that in the world's second largest economy, which is on its way to becoming the largest and plays such an important geopolitical role, there's no need to send anyone. How dysfunctional administrations in the West have become is also shown, for example, by the recent non-visit, actually the attempted visit, of Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul to China. So it can really be summed up like this. Germany is forgoing diplomacy. It is essentially giving up on diplomacy. There's this belief that one can somehow lecture great powers morally from afar instead of engaging in dialogue with them.
Der Besuch, der geplant war von Außenminister Wadephul...
The visit planned by Foreign Minister Wadephul was, at least according to media reports, cancelled because the Chinese side showed no interest in meeting with him. On the other hand, it's also quite clear that Germany hasn't made much of an effort to engage in an honest dialogue with China about what the relationship should actually look like. In your view, where do you think the relationship is struggling the most?
Basically, one has to say that Wadephul represents a constant. He's just one pearl in a chain. Let's remember Heiko Maas, whom I accompanied as a parliamentary delegate during his inaugural visit to China in 2018 or 2017. Let's also remember Annalena Baerbock, who during a visit to the US felt the need to rail against China on the conservative American TV channel Fox News. Or now also Johann Wadephul, who since his first trip to Asia as foreign minister has not traveled to China, our largest trading partner, now again the second largest, though that changes constantly, but instead to Japan. There, he recalled the darkest hours of German-Japanese history, such as the alliance in the Anti-Comintern Pact between Japan and Germany in 1936 and 1937, and later also with Mussolini's Italy, together against the Soviet Union and China. This also fueled Japanese militarism. In Japan, he once again designated Japan as the most important strategic partner in the region, calling it a premium partner and saying that joint action was needed against the dangers in the region. In China, of course, this is being observed very closely, and people there see what kind of tradition this apparently places them in once again.
Sieht, wo man offensichtlich in welcher Tradition man stehen muss. Also ist eine Perle in einer Kette, Heiko Maas, Annalena
So he is a
Baerbock
pearl in a
und
chain, Heiko Maas, Annalena Baerbock, and Wadephul. And this decline of Germany is very clearly visible here. In Beijing, there is great skepticism toward the European vassal states, and one has to say Germany is among them, a vassal state of the USA. Germany is being pushed into this confrontation, into the front line against China. And there is great skepticism because in the end, they only do what Washington wants, countries like Germany or the European Union as a whole. The impression arises that one cannot rely on any dependable agreements with Germany either. Germany is perceived as a state that only does what Washington wants. For example, at this Shandong Forum, there was also no representative of the European Union. Behind the scenes, it was rumored that it was mainly the United States that had pressured EU countries not to appear at this security policy conference. Not even, for instance, at the parade celebrating 80 years of victory over Japanese militarism in the anti-fascist war. There, too, no representative of the European Union was present, neither from the European countries nor from Germany. And that, too, is said to have happened under pressure from the United States. This is, of course, a major problem for Germany because, in my opinion, it is a foolish illusion to think that one could stand up to China in a confrontation.
In einer Konfrontation gegenüber China bestehen.
Ja, eine Konfrontation mit China, aber auch diese
Yes, a confrontation with China, but also this current ideological build-up, saying that we're basically refusing dialogue, refusing diplomacy. We can see that with regard to Russia, and now we're seeing it with regard to China as well. And this idea that Europeans can currently define the entire worldview. I was quite astonished when the EU's foreign representative, Ms. Callas, said in a conversation that we should reinterpret the entire Second World War and not recognize Russia and China as victorious nations, but instead say that we should reinterpret the war as the liberation of Europe, thanks to America. How can you and others who are still in contact with China maintain any kind of relationship with Chinese colleagues at such forums? And perhaps explain what is currently happening in Europe.
Dort vielleicht auch zu erklären, was im Moment in Europa alles vor sich geht.
Naja, erklären kann man es, man kann es nur nicht entschuldigen, weil
Well, you can explain it. You just can't excuse it because it's truly inexcusable that the EU's foreign representative, and that's actually what happened with her recent remarks, namely Kaja Kallas, caused very, very great incomprehension in China. The Estonian had, in the name of the EU, questioned whether China and the Soviet Union had played a decisive role in the victory over Nazi Germany and Japanese militarism. And that is truly an absolute insult, considering the more than 27 million Soviet lives lost in the fight against fascism. And according to the official count by the Chinese, there were over 35 million deaths in the fight against Japanese militarism. Even before the start of World War II, Japan had already launched its attack. Taken together, the period before and after World War II, this struggle claimed over 35 million victims in the fight against the Japanese fascists. And against this background of such tactless remarks, one really has to say, you have to wonder whether the political leadership of the EU still has all its marbles. They seem to have become completely idiotic by now, and that's exactly how it comes across in China. From what I've experienced in China so far, all my conversation partners have been very intelligent and very wise.
Auch sehr bescheiden, aber wirklich sehr, sehr intelligente Menschen.
And also very modest, but truly very, very intelligent people whom I have met during my several visits to China so far. And I must say, China approaches the US and Europe with great sobriety, also because of such statements and, for example, the trade policies, tariffs, and sanctions imposed against China and Russia. And they are prepared for provocations of any kind. That is my observation in China. And that is also a major difference from the West. people there think in the long term. And so far, I have had really good experiences, very good exchanges, and very good dialogue on an equal footing.
Sehr guten Austausch, sehr guten Dialog auf Augenhöhe. Das ist es, was ich über die chinesische Diplomatie sage.
That's what I can say about Chinese diplomacy. I mean, among the 1,800 participants at the Shangsung Forum from over 100 countries, many representatives of very small states, small countries, were prominently included in the plenary sessions, on panels, and also behind the closed-door meetings. That's not at all the case at the NATO or Munich Security Conference, where it's really just about arms deals, showing off, and supporting war policies. There, people don't meet on equal footing.
Ist es nicht der Fall, da begegnet man sich nicht auf Augenhöhe, da gibt es ein von oben herab von
There's a condescending attitude from the US and its vassal states. And it's completely different in China. Africa, Latin America, South America, Asia, all these regions are always given a very prominent place in everything China does because they genuinely want diplomacy on an equal footing. They want reciprocity, and of course, they also want the other side to accept and respect that in relation to China. And that's something you don't see with the Europeans. With the Europeans, I always have the feeling that whenever I'm in China, I constantly have to explain what the reason for that might be and why.
Woran das liegen mag, warum? Weil man sich wirklich an den Kopf fasst in China und sagt, also wie.
Because in China, people are really shaking their heads and saying, how can it be that in Europe they pursue such policies, including economic policies, that are so contrary to the interests of their own population and also to their own strategic and economic interests? So since the war in Ukraine, they've adopted the 19th sanctions package. The 19th package to bring Russia to its knees, as Foreign Minister Baerbock said, to ruin Russia. But what they've actually ruined is the German economy, German industry. It's on the ground, that's what they've achieved. And now they're already planning the next package, and that's just completely insane. Instead, they could, for example, take a page from China's book.
Ein Beispiel an China nehmen. China ist ja auch deshalb ein faszinierendes Land, weil es auch versucht, soziale
China is also a fascinating country because it tries to combine social justice for everyone with economic innovation, something that is rarely recognized here. China wants to create a welfare state that protects people from life's risks. It does not rely on a neoliberal squandering of public property, for example. In China, there is no foolish illusion, as we have with ordoliberalism, that the market automatically creates social justice if the state is not defended against monopolies. There is simply a conviction that efficient state planning is, in the long run, actually superior to the Western states, which are increasingly reverting to a night watchman state. And I think we should look to China more often in that regard.
It's very, very interesting what you're saying. In Japan, they didn't just swallow that neoliberal potion so easily either. And there's more attention paid to people, even though, of course, the jargon and so on are clearly shaped by the West. But Asia simply works a bit differently in that sense. And here we already have a problem. Europeans are always used to telling other parts of the world what they're doing wrong, and that they should be more like the Europeans.
Und dass sie mehr so sein sollten wie die Europäer. Andererseits sehen wir im Moment, gerade in Deutschland, dass der
On the other hand, we're currently seeing, especially in Germany, that the welfare state is being sacrificed in favor of militarism. Mr. Merz, I believe, said, "We no longer have money for social assistance, but we're rearming, a 5% NATO target, so apparently there's money for that." Could you comment on how this militarism is not only ruining the state right now, but also the entire social fabric that we on the left thought we had built up over the past 60 or 70 years?
Dass wir es aufgebaut haben über die letzten 60, 70 Jahre.
Ja, es ist tatsächlich so,
Yes, it is indeed the case that the massive rearmament, we really have to speak of an unprecedented rearmament. There has never been anything like this in the history of the Federal Republic of Germany since the end of the war, since 1945. NATO is massively arming itself here and is also expanding into Asia through bilateral military pacts, demanding, so to speak, tribute from its vassals, such as the Federal Republic and the other NATO states, to spend 5% of their gross domestic product on the military. 5% of the gross domestic product currently means 220 to 225 billion euros. This year, 2025, in Germany, we are told this by the federal government of the CDU, CSU, and SPD, we have a record-breaking budget, and in that regard, they are actually right.
Der Superlative und in einem haben wir tatsächlich recht. Das ist ein Haushalt der Superlative, den
This is a budget of superlatives. There hasn't been anything like it since 1945, since the founding of the Republic. The federal budget amounts to around 505 billion euros. Now, you can calculate how much 220 or 225 billion is. That's almost half. Yes, it's almost half of the entire federal budget. And that's where they want to get to. At the moment, it's about 100, somewhere between 90 and 100. And there are also sometimes hidden expenses. One always has to talk about military spending, because the defense budget, which is already the second largest item in the current budget, is not the total for military expenditures. All the bases are added on top of that, and so on.
Und da muss man halt mehr Geld reinberechnen. Und das ist halt ungefähr.
And you just have to factor in more money. And that's roughly 90 to 100 billion that's being spent now. So over 2% at the moment. And in the coming years, they want to reach 5%. And of course, that means nothing else. And Merz is of course right about that. He says, we can no longer afford the welfare state. Naturally, anyone who has had such a massive rearmament forced and imposed upon them can't put money into the welfare state, infrastructure, healthcare, education, and thus the future of our nation, but has to put it into the military. You can only spend each euro once. And just taking on more debt won't make it all work.
Durch die Schuldenaufnahme allein wird das alles nicht gehen. Und deshalb gehen sie jetzt langsam ran.
And that's why they're taking it slowly now. The absurd thing, though, just as an example, they said they want to save 1.8 billion from citizens' benefit recipients. 1.8 billion, or I think it was from nursing care insurance. In any case, they want to ease the budget a bit by cutting costs, and at the same time they're promising Ukraine an additional 3 billion on top of the previous commitments. That's simply absurd. Chancellor Merz says here that we can no longer afford the welfare state. That's why we'll all have to tighten our belts now.
Deshalb werden wir alle jetzt den Gürtel enger schnallen müssen. Selbst ist natürlich nicht drin.
He himself is, of course, not affected. But at the same time, his finance minister, Lars Klingbeil, the SPD chairman, travels to Kiev and promises to pay Ukraine 9 billion euros over the next 3 years for weapons aid, for military aid. That's absurd. It makes no sense at all. And that's why frustration is growing. The infrastructure here is falling apart. Bridges that are broken aren't repaired for years. Roads are in poor condition. Deutsche Bahn, it's a lottery. It wasn't like that in China. No matter which train you board in China, you arrive on time, have a pleasant trip, are served and get a hot meal.
In Deutschland ist das Bistro oftmals geschlossen, weil
in Germany, the bistro is often closed because something is missing in the catering. You're lucky if you even arrive at your destination on the same day, let alone with all the delays. It's really so run down. And yet, money is being poured into the military, while everything else is being cut back. Schools and universities have been teaching in containers for years because so many construction projects are in such disrepair that they would need fixing, but can't be fixed. It's simply no longer justifiable. And this is happening, and will, of course, become even bigger and more drastic, with this massive rearmament that has actually been set in motion in Germany.
Die in Deutschland tatsächlich auf die Schiene gesetzt wurde. Und da muss man eins wissen.
And one thing you have to understand, Germany hides its vassal relationship with the United States behind this new militarism, it must be said, because this militarism is actually being pushed from the outside. The U.S. is demanding 5% of the gross domestic product for the military. Germany jumps and has decided to do that. The U.S. wants more German soldiers. We currently have 280, 240, 260,000 are being demanded by the Americans so that we are prepared for a war against Russia. because they are preparing for a war, it must be said. They no longer even talk about defense capability. They talk about war readiness. And now the federal government wants to introduce conscription in order to meet the target demanded by the United States with even more Bundeswehr soldiers. And that has a certain momentum of its own. You can also see that more and more historical parallels are being drawn. Germany's neighboring states may be celebrating Chancellor Friedrich Merz's statement that Germany is to be rebuilt as Europe's strongest military power. But I say, they might be in for a surprise, because you can't rely too confidently on the United States as a protective power. The Afghan government already had to learn that when the US handed the country over to the Taliban.
Das Land an die Taliban übergeben haben.
Yes, I just wonder. Sometimes you really have to shake your head, especially if you've studied a bit of history. A militarized Germany, what could possibly go wrong? You'd have to have some pretty bizarre thoughts to think that could turn out to be the worst thing. But somehow, that historical awareness behind it doesn't seem to work anymore. What you just explained, however, is absolutely present in China. By the way, in Japan, unfortunately, that's also the case, though in a different way, not in the same way as in Germany, but that's another story. How do you see this, the propaganda, and also how this propaganda right now, especially the hatred of Russia that's being stirred up, and also the fear of Russia, that tomorrow the Russians will once again be standing in Berlin, while conveniently leaving out why they had to be in Berlin in 1945 in the first place. But that part is simply omitted. How do you see this development? Now also in terms of the facts on the ground, the electorate and so on. Something interesting is happening. We're being told more and more of the unvarnished truth, especially from the USA, where the Department of Defense has now been renamed the Ministry of War, where the US is concentrating 25% of its naval forces off the coast of Venezuela, thereby already violating the UN Charter, since even the threat of force is prohibited. Right, so it's becoming increasingly clear where the West's militarism is heading. In your opinion, does this have an impact on the reality on the ground, especially when you look at how the AfD has grown in Germany?
Auch wenn man sich anschaut, wie die AfD gewachsen ist in Deutschland.
Yes, well, I think that despite the propagandistic barrage of recent years, there is still a substantial majority of the German population that does not want war. And you can see that among young people as well. According to surveys, a majority of young people in Germany do not want conscription. They don't want to join the Bundeswehr because they say, I don't want to be cannon fodder for a war started by politicians, where I'm supposed to shoot or kill or possibly die myself for the interests of those people. So there is a rejection, and of course, among many older people as well, partly because they have war experiences. Only the middle group is a bit different. Those are the ones who used to be conscientious objectors, by the way, like the Greens, who have now become the biggest warmongers in this country. I've always said that those loudmouths should be sent to the front, but they should leave us and our children alone. I think that's already a substantial majority. Many surveys say the same, but we shouldn't underestimate it. NATO is waging a cognitive war, and Germany is part of that, meaning the German Bundeswehr.
Deutschland und die deutsche Bundeswehr, sie wollen in die Köpfe der Menschen und diese sogenannten Experten.
They want to get into people's heads, and these so-called experts who are passed around on every talk show, but who, in my view, really lack any real expertise. And in the end, they just say what their sponsors tell them to say, that we absolutely have to arm ourselves. We need ammunition, we need missiles, we need soldiers, we need tanks. It's repeated from morning to night. It's really a total mental mobilization, one has to say. And also this insult to anyone's intelligence, to claim that the Russians are inferior to the NATO countries in all conventional forces, but that nevertheless the Russians could be at our doorstep tomorrow and therefore we must rearm.
Aber trotzdem, der Russe könnte morgen vor unserer Tür stehen und deshalb müssen wir aufrüsten. Also das ist eine Beleidigung des Intellekts. Also entweder ist der Russe jetzt
Well, that's an insult to our intelligence. Either the Russians are weaker than we are now, and they are, statistically in all branches of the armed forces, at sea, on land, and in the air, they're weaker than NATO in conventional terms. And then you can't turn around and say we need to spend even more on armaments and the military than NATO countries already do. NATO spends as much on the military as the rest of the world combined, including China and Russia, and yet they still want to spend more. That means it's really about something entirely different. And among the public, the problem is that many people have given up. Many feel powerless because they think politics won't change anything anyway. And you mentioned the AfD. With the AfD, of course, it's going to be an interesting story because there are at least two factions within the AfD. One is a very transatlantic faction, one that essentially promotes selling out to the US oligarchs. The worst part was his attitude. You can see that, yes, everything the US does, Trump, Musk, and others, whatever they want, they'd like to have it here as well. It's a party that supports NATO's 2% target. They support spending on military armament. It's a pro-NATO party. And it's also a party that, for example, supports the reintroduction of compulsory military service. So, the chairwoman Alice Weidel once stated that she supports introducing a 2-year mandatory military service for young people. She also supports, for example, Bundeswehr missions abroad when they serve German interests, and she has no problem with drone strikes, that is, with so-called extrajudicial killings. But then there's another faction that wants to maintain good relations with Russia, is somewhat critical of NATO, and rejects conscription. That's the other chairman, Tino Krupala, if I may put it that way. But I think that's also a bit of a tactical move, because the AfD can't score points in Eastern Germany with its pro-US, pro-NATO, pro-armament, pro-conscription stance. And that's why I believe it's more of a tactical element, something that's been done before, pretending, so to speak. I mean, if someone supports friendship with Russia, anyone who supports NATO can hardly, simply cannot, want that kind of relationship with Russia. That's a contradiction in itself. And in that sense, it will be interesting to see how things develop. My observation from the US, from my many trips there and my contacts, is that the US administration is pushing to establish, to anchor a Maloney-type region in Germany. And for that, they would need blue-black, black-blue. That's why, from my point of view, there will be increasing pressure on the AfD from transatlantic forces for them to push through, to drive the stakes in so that such a government can be formed. And at the same time, there are also, within the CDU-CSU parliamentary group, some tentative moves toward opening up to future cooperation with the AfD. Although I have to say, I think the firewall that the other parties are actually maintaining is wrong. In my opinion, it is unworthy of the democracy we have because you have to defeat them on substance, not with a firewall. The firewall has made the AfD strong. It hasn't weakened it. This allowed the party to portray itself as a martyr, as a victim, and to pretend it was different from the old parties. And I say yes, in many areas, whether in economic policy, social policy, or even in foreign and security policy, it is almost identical to the CDU. There are very, very large similarities. But this firewall has meant that it was not possible to convey that politically to many voters. And I would wish that voters had greater insight, a clearer understanding of what the AfD actually stands for.
Yes, that's the problem with the AfD. It has become so large that it now has these different factions. And if you look at the AfD's party platform, it still says, I believe, that they want to promote direct democracy. Or am I mistaken? So there are very moderate elements within the AfD,
and there are very extreme representatives of the AfD. As for peace policy, unfortunately, that's really how it is. The left-wing party that once stood for it, and the Sahra Wagenknecht alliance, which currently claims that cause for itself, are being demonized on social media as pro-Putin parties. The level of discussion is extremely low, especially on platforms like X and so on. How do you currently see the role of pacifism or peace policy? How significant is it among the population?
Well, as I said, I think the majority of the population in Germany doesn't want war. That's my observation. But what's missing is the mobilization of that majority. That's where things are weak. And there are various reasons for that. It also has to do, for example, with how people assess the Trump administration. Many think he's actually a president of peace, someone who brings peace, doesn't wage wars, and therefore should be supported. But others see the situation a bit more clearly. So in my opinion, it depends very much on how fragmented, how divided, for example, the peace movement is in its analysis and accordingly in its strategy. And when it comes to Ukraine, the situation is this. We're saying it, even the U.S. intelligence agencies, which repeatedly state in their annual report in the spring that there is no threat from Russia to NATO or NATO countries, are still pushing for this rearmament, this mobilization, and this deterrence, as they call it. And now Germany is supposed to secure NATO's eastern flank. In the Baltics, they're already there with a tank brigade. 5,000 soldiers are stationed there. Germany bears responsibility for that, which, in my view, is disastrous, because instead of pursuing peace with Russia, preparations are being made here for war against Russia, at the behest of the United States. And I say this, the Trump administration regarding the war in Ukraine, he had promised to end that war within 24 hours. It was clear that this wouldn't happen in 24 hours. But the Trump administration was initially willing, for example, to recognize that NATO's eastward expansion, and also the attempt in 2008, I believe, to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, was the red line. And that line was knowingly crossed at the time. But now one has to say, the Trump administration is increasingly shifting toward Biden's course. The only difference is that the Europeans are now paying for the American weapons for Ukraine in this war with Russia. The result is an overstretched NATO, but the problem is that this keeps many people from taking action themselves and mobilizing. And now the example of the non-aggression pact. That's also an issue. If you reject it, you obviously don't want to keep all options open. And NATO is a US-led enterprise, that's all it is. If you reject this offer of a non-aggression pact, you want to keep all options open. And I get the feeling that just like in 2021, Russia isn't being taken seriously. There was a similar proposal back in 2021. And that leads to these discrepancies also contribute to the discussions happening in Germany. Is something being done there now? Is there a movement, a peace movement? Is there a movement to end the war? But if you leave it up to them, nothing will come of it. And in Germany, there's the additional problem that within the traditional peace movement, people don't want to cooperate with the new peace movement, which is dominated by or close to the AfD, because they don't want to be associated with it. That may also have to do with the fact that the analyses differ. The AfD side says Trump is the president of peace. He brings us peace. And the others, the traditional peace movement, say, wait a minute, the strategy is completely different. And the US, or rather US foreign policy under Trump, is once again a classic imperialist policy, without frills, without all the human rights fuss. You mentioned it at the beginning. It's about gathering up resources in spheres of geopolitical influence. In Latin America, it's about oil. in Venezuela, for example, where they claim it's about fighting drugs. But we know it's not about fighting drugs, it's about oil. And even the so-called fight against drugs, or now more recently, the pressure on Nigeria and other African countries, they're not safe from Trump when he has this hunger for raw materials and spheres of influence. And that's the problem. The neocons are back in the US, only worse. And if the analysis is wrong, you obviously can't develop the right strategy. And that, of course, also affects strategy in Germany.
Beeinflusst eben auch die Strategie in Deutschland.
The last time Germany defied Washington's dictates was in 2003 during the Iraq War. Germany didn't take part but simply said, "No, we're not going along with this." And for a long time the Americans held that against Germany. But the point was that in 2003, the attack on Iraq was such a blatant violation of the principle of peace, an act of aggression. And as we now know in hindsight, all the claims about weapons of mass destruction were completely fabricated. It was simply a terrible breach of international law.
Verstoß gegen das Völkerrecht. Wenn jetzt aber mit Venezuela und auch mit Nigeria.
But now, with Venezuela and also with Nigeria, and what we saw in the summer with the US attack on Iran, the bombing of a nuclear facility, when Mr. Merz then says that this is the dirty work Israel and the US are doing for us, that was indeed a very terrible statement. That this breach of international law isn't even being glossed over. They're officially saying, well, in this case it was fine. But what do you think? Will this plain truth that's now being served to us put the German government under pressure to eventually distance itself? Or is that just wishful thinking?
No, I don't think so. So the federal government, under Annalena Baerbock as the Green foreign minister, but also before that under the Social Democrat Heiko Maas, and I suppose Wagenknecht won't do it either. If there's a recount, then we as the BSW will re-enter the German Bundestag. And this Bundestag, this federal government, is in all likelihood not legitimate because the BSW actually belongs in the Bundestag. Then I would ask another question, since I have repeatedly asked the federal government before whether the attack on Iraq by the coalition of the willing was and is a war of aggression in violation of international law. And that has not been interpreted that way to this day. There is no statement from the federal government declaring that the Iraq war was an illegal war of aggression under international law. The same goes for Yugoslavia, and we know that they also lied to us about Yugoslavia, about Iraq, about Libya, for example, about Syria, and we know that about Vietnam as well. So there are many instances in history where wars often began with lies, and I don't think that in a situation where Germany is even more transatlantic in orientation than it was in 2003, in the media, in think tanks, in these policy institutes, in these foundations, anything about that will change. In politics, a much greater influence can now be traced by the USA, from the USA within these transatlantic relations, than was the case in 2003. That means there will be even less genuine criticism. And as you mentioned, this shows the double standard in the NATO states' criticism of Russia, how hypocritical it is when the USA or Israel illegally bomb Iran or reduce Gaza to rubble. Then it's said, that's the dirty work. When Russia wages a war, which I, of course, judge, but unlike those people, no war is mine. And that's our slogan. No war is our war. But they just say, well, the war that isn't ours is evil. And the other one, the one that is ours or waged by our villains, that one's fine. For example, the illegitimate president of Syria, al-Shara, actually Jolani, a former al-Qaeda fighter, an Islamist who had a large bounty on his head and was under sanctions. And now he's their villain, right? He took over Syria, and that's why he's being celebrated. So in that sense, I have to pour a bit of water into the wine and disappoint. I don't think there will actually be any condemnation. I haven't heard any criticism to this day. There has been no criticism from the German federal government regarding the threat of violence or the illegal killings. These are murders. More than 50 people have already been killed by the U.S. Army, by U.S. forces off the coast of Venezuela, and they make no secret of it. U.S. Secretary of Defense Austin even posts videos on social media showing them killing people, simply sinking ships, without charges, without trial, without judgment. And these are illegal killings. And to this day, the German federal government has not condemned them.
Und das wurde bis heute von der deutschen Bundesregierung nicht verurteilt. Und das sagt
And that is exactly the regime change agenda that has been pursued against Venezuela for years. I would like to remind everyone, Germany and the EU were also the ones who, at the behest of the USA, recognized the presidential candidate of the so-called opposition in Venezuela, Guaido, promoting him for years as the legitimate president. When the USA then changed its course, the same was quietly done here as well. So I fear that we are on a completely fundamental track. And that is why there will be no criticism or distancing from an illegal attack by the USA on Venezuela. And it must be said the attack is already underway.
Ja, das ist in voller Mann laufen und sonst.
Yes, it's in full swing. Otherwise, the Ford, the aircraft carrier with its escort ships, wouldn't be heading there. Well, it's tragic where we stand right now. This vassalage, not just of Germany, but of Europe in general, is driving us further and further into this war hysteria. And we know from the past, that usually doesn't end well. We have to be able to stop it somewhere. Maybe one last word. Where would you look for glimmers of hope, where we might be able to stop something?
Lichtblicken suchen, wo wir etwas anhalten können.
So I believe the neocons are indeed back, but worse. However, there is a change in the international order because their biggest problem is China. So let's return to China. That's where the real teeth are showing. They are forced to make compromises, and the decline of the United States, along with its refusal to accept a multipolar world that is emerging, is bringing increasing instability to the world. That's one side of it, and that's why it's all the more important to push back. Germany needs a strong movement for neutrality. Germany needs a strong movement for peace with Russia. And only when we acknowledge the realities of a multipolar world will we truly have a chance to stop this decline. And that's why I'm calling on everyone in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, where there are also these neutrality initiatives, that we really work more closely together, but also with the peace movements in the United States, those who stand for peace, for cooperation instead of confrontation, for diplomacy on equal footing. They see that this emerging multipolar world, or already with the BRICS, and it must be said, they've already introduced the yuan currency in many BRICS countries, only has a chance in this way, and can then also represent a win-win situation for both, for all sides. That gives me hope. It's always like this. There's always a side of hope. And what's important is that those of us who believe in it stick together, strengthen one another, and try to mobilize. I also advocate, and I mean this for Germany as well, that these peace movements should welcome and include everyone who, with a good heart, stands for peace and for dialogue instead of confrontation in foreign and security policy, because that's the only way we can become stronger. Otherwise, we're doing NATO's work for them, letting ourselves be divided, letting ourselves be weakened, and they prevail. And that's what we really have to stand up against.
Yes, pushback from civil society and solidarity among those who simply and clearly say, not with us. Not with my children, not with me. Well, thank you very much, Sevim Dagdelen, for your time. And for people who want to read more from you, where should they go?
Die können bei mir auf meine Homepage Sevim Dagdelen.
They can check my website at sevimdagdelen.de. Things I publish often appear there as well on Overton, on the Nachdenkseiten, but also on my website or on Twitter at Sevim Dagdelen.
Auf meiner Homepage oder auf Twitter bei Sevim Dagdelen.
Okay, I'll link it in the video description. Sevim Dagdelen, thank you very much for your time today.
Ich danke auch.
Thank you as well.